Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing really well. So in today's episode, we are talking about the brand new tech horror movie released on Netflix, Choose or Die. Choose or Die follows Isaac, an 80s obsessed programmer who discovers a strange game from the 80s called Cursor. His friend Kayla, living off a minimum wage, is tempted by the $125,000 prize money and decides to play the game. After a series of unexpected, terrifying events, she soon realises she's no longer playing for the money, but for her own life. I missed the initial announcement for the release of this movie, but I kept seeing the movie poster pop up in my Letterboxd feed, and when I read the synopsis out of curiosity, I was really excited about it. As a horror fan and a casual gamer, it sounded right up my street, and I'm also a really big fan of the tech horror subgenre. So let's get into it and talk about Choose or Die. I'm going to talk about some positive elements to do with the film and then some negative elements to do with the film, and then at the end I'll give you guys my overall thoughts, and this is going to be a spoiler-free review. Since its release, Choose or Die has not had the most positive reviews. It currently has a rotten rating of 30% on Rotten Tomatoes, with an audience rating of 26% and a rating of 2.1 on Letterboxd. Choose or Die stars Iola Evans, Asa Butterfield and Robert Englund, and is directed and co-written by Toby Meakins. This is a feature film debut for Meakins, who has previously only directed shorts and episodes. What's strange about Choose or Die is that it actually has a mostly British cast, with Asa Butterfield, who stars in another Netflix original, the TV series Sex Education, and Eddie Marsan, who stars in Edgar Wright's World End, and Melanie Griffith, who is a British soap regular. It was also filmed in London, yet for some reason the film's story is actually set in an unspecified American city. So we have these British actors being forced to do sometimes questionable American accents. I just didn't understand why the film had to be set in America while it was filmed in England and had an English cast. I mean, there was nothing in the 80s nostalgia or old tech that wouldn't work in an English setting, and there was no pop culture references that wouldn't be understood, and the two leads' living situations would translate to a British setting. Perhaps it was believed that it would be more commercially successful if it did have an American setting. I mean, the Netflix originals are accessible across the world, so maybe they just thought that this would be a more accessible setting. I think there was quite a lot of excitement about the release of Choose or Die, especially in the horror community, as there is a cameo in it by Robert Englund, who is an absolute horror staple, most famously for playing Freddy Krueger, but he's also starred in numerous horror movies over the decades, from Urban Legend to the Lake Placid sequels. However, Robert Englund's role was only a voiceover role. He's actually the voice at the end of the line that you call when you win the game and you call to claim your prize money. It's fun, especially when Asa Butterfield hears his voice and fanboys out, but I was disappointed that this was all we got. Okay, so now let's talk about some positives in the movie. So first up, I did really like the look of this movie. There were some scenes that were really quite stylised and beautifully shot. I'm thinking mostly of exterior shots of buildings, especially the house that bookends the movie and the Kismet building that Kayla cleans in. And there are also some journey scenes that are actually really nicely shot as well, especially when Kayla is just riding her bike around the city. There's also this really unusual scene later on in the movie where Kayla and Isaac are driving out to a location looking for clues, and the image of them driving in the car very quickly turns into this pixelated gameplay image, and it stood out as really unusual, even in a film that is referencing games from the 80s, which are very pixelated. So yeah, it was very strange, but I quite liked it. Another positive for me is the relationship between the two main leads. It's a very sweet, supportive friendship that they have, but it's very evident that Isaac wants more than just a friendship. But despite this, the movie doesn't force any kind of romance between them. I also enjoy how Kayla isn't sidelined in the movie to be Isaac's sidekick, despite the fact that the trailer and the advertising all pushed Asa Butterfield's character to the forefront. It is in fact Kayla's story and Kayla's journey, But both lead characters have equal skills to contribute to their situation. Kayla is also given a lot of depth and backstory to her character. We see her living situation and her financial struggles as she takes on an almost carer role towards her mum after a tragic event that happened in their lives. This event also becomes important later on in the movie while playing a certain level in the game, as the game uses this to manipulate Kayla. Choose or Die certainly taps into that 80s nostalgia that is having a real surge at the moment, aided by the release of things like Stranger Things and the It remake. But while it's not actually set in the 80s, there's definitely lots of nods to it, and there are two characters that are absolutely obsessed with the 80s, and we see lots of things from that decade, from Walkmans, cars, vinyl players, video games and technology. What's interesting though is that there's nothing bright or colourful about this movie. All of the vibrancy that is often associated with the 80s isn't evident here. The film actually has a very dark tone to it, both in content and in imagery. Even the items from the 80s are affected by the film's dark tone. One of the characters who's obsessed with the decade has to hide away his entire collection in one room hidden in his house. And when we first see this room, all the lights are off, so it's really dark and dingy. And Isaac's car is from the 80s but is beaten up. And then even all of the technology and video games, they're all broken and grimy and just dumped haphazardly in boxes. And the final positive for me with this movie is its runtime. At just an hour and 25 minutes, it's a nice, easy watch. And while I don't mind films with a long runtime, I do think sometimes it's hard to find time to sit down and watch them. So I do appreciate a movie with a shorter runtime. And now let's talk about some of the negatives in the movie. I mentioned in the positives that there are references to the 80s. But the film kind of made me feel that the characters that are obsessed with the 80s are portrayed in a bit of a negative light and almost poked fun of. One character is mocked by his wife and son and has to hide his interest away in a room. And Isaac is mocked, although in a much more harmless way, by Kayla too. I think potentially the movie's attitude towards the 80s might be summed up in Kayla, who shouts "fuck the 80s" to another character. I also mentioned that Kayla is given a lot of backstory in the film, and while I like this, I do think that the film is oddly intercut with the horror side of the story and the evil game scenes with the drama side of the story and the dark events in Kayla's life. I'll be honest, it does feel odd at times and can really pull you out of the evil game side of the film when we cut back over to the drama side. But, they're incredibly sad and well portrayed, and so would probably be interesting just as a drama on their own. The special effects in this film, in some parts, are not the greatest. I'm thinking of two scenes in particular. One where someone is trying to eat their own arm, and another one involving VHS ribbon tape. Now, I was surprised by the level of gore in this film, considering that it's a Netflix original. However, the bad effects do take away from quite a few of these scenes. Another negative for me is that this film doesn't seem to know what it is. It dabbles in lots of different subgenres, and there were actually parts of the film that reminded me a little bit of Saw. There were other parts that reminded me of Escape Room, and of course the choosing between two things is very similar to the interactive element of the Black Mirror episode Bandersnatch. And while horror has often been hard to pin down to one subgenre, as horror movies can blend genres and blur the line between being categorised, I still think it's important for the film itself to actually know what it is. A lot of it feels mismeshed and repeats of things that we have actually seen before, and in some cases done a lot better. I also never really felt any real threat towards the characters, and I know that sounds odd, as certain characters are put in dangerous situations and injured. But despite these dangerous situations being real, I never felt as though the film built any level of tension. There's one scene where a character's life is in danger and death is a real possibility for them, but I had no idea that this was what was happening until after the fact. And on top of that, the scene has a lot of silliness to it, which removes a lot of the emotion. Another huge negative for me, and probably the biggest problem that I have with the film, and that is that it doesn't seem to know what its point is. I said before that Choose or Die dips its toe into other subgenres and other films, but those other films had a clear message for its characters and its audience. For example, in Saw, John Kramer places people in his trap so that they can learn to value their own lives and stop doing things to hurt other people's lives. goods. And in Ringu, Sadako makes the videotape as a form of revenge for her murder. And in Unfriended, that's another form of revenge and consequences for online bullying. Okay, so I think for this point, to make more sense, I am going to have to include spoilers for the end of the movies. So that's your guys' heads up to skedaddle if you haven't seen the film yet. So we are given an explanation as to how and why the game was made and how it's a bit of a science experiment to prove that the use of certain symbols allows the user to gain and thrive through the pain and suffering of others. As in a lot of these cases, the creator goes mad with the power and abuses the game to maintain his own gains. So our lead, Kayla, once she wins, chooses to use the game for good, punishing those that hurt others. For example, the drug dealer who was playing on her mum's suffering and selling to her. But this is Kayla's choice. It is not a lesson that she learns through the movie, and it is not a proviso set by the game itself. So in actual fact, you could have somebody win and use the game in a reckless way. So what is the game and the movie's message? That once you've survived pain and suffering, you can inflict pain and suffering on someone else to gain back everything you've lost and more. So there you have it, guys, my review of the new release on Netflix, Choose or Die. I'll be honest, I didn't love this one. I was actually quite disappointed with it. I think the concept of a killer game is absolutely brilliant, and I loved how they chose to use outdated technology and found a way to make it believable that somebody would stumble upon it. But while I think that Choose or Die has a lot of positives to it, for the most part, it just missed the mark and its full potential. As it's streaming on Netflix, I would still advise you guys to go and check it out and make up your own minds, and then you can let me know down in the comments below what you thought about the film. I think my next episode is going to be somewhat of a two-parter to this review. I'm going to look at tech horror when it's done well, recommendations of other tech horror movies, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already so you don't miss out on that. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye, guys.